do you have the ability to show your faces? In my other classes, if I don't see faces, the student is marked absent.
Just so I know, Dan, I know, I did see John's face for a little bit. A lot of times, people in other classes, we tell them to, sort of show your face and then turn off camera because of bandwidth.
If absolutely necessary, but we have so little time with each other, and students go through future generations now, not as a cohort. So not only do I not know you, and you don't know me, but many of you don't know each other. So if we have the ability to at least begin putting faces to names some, that'll be great. So welcome. And today, our basic question is, whose reality counts? And I gave you a couple of very, very different readings. One from social science, James Rush, who I think gives a very sweet and succinct sweep of Southeast Asian history, with Vietnam right in the middle of it. And it's important to know that Vietnam doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's there in the middle of 10 other countries, so 11 Southeast Asian states that were not states. Why did they become states? They were happy before they were states. Why did you have to become a state, So there is so much of that history that James Rush talks about that we want to look at. And then a completely different reading, but also giving you the sweep of Vietnamese history in that region, is Thuy M's novella, M. And M is a very special word. It means lover. It means little sister. It means precious one. Our dog, our smallest dog, is called M, and it means little sister in that context. She's the youngest of three Shih Tzu dogs, so she's M. But Thuy M, I'm sorry, Gim Thuy uses the word M as such an important concept. And I think if you're listening for it, you'll hear a lot of people use that word in different contexts in Vietnam. So anyway, we've got 90 minutes, and we're going to jump into a PowerPoint, but I'll jump in and out of the PowerPoint. And we'll also do a couple of writings today. And what I'm trying to convey is the importance, the absolute importance of thinking critically through writing. And we're going to do two different kinds of writing. We're going to do a private free write, which is just for yourself. And you can write it in whatever language you want. You can draw a picture if you want. But the key is you have to have pencil or pen on paper, and you need to be writing or drawing for 5 minutes. And you don't share that with Chris, with me, or anyone. The second kind of writing we'll do today is a focused free write, where I'll give you 5 minutes, and it will be in English. And again, you put the pen to the paper for 5 minutes, and you don't stop until I invite you to stop. And then we will bracket good material in that focused free write, and you will share what you have written, and only what you have written. No editing, no spoken word beyond reading what you bracketed from your writing. Why do we do that? Because your brain really thinks differently and critically through writing. And it's a completely different composure and organization of thought if you're sharing with us what you wrote as opposed to just talking. All right? There are two important ways of communicating, but when we do writing, we're going to stick to it. And we're going to continue that practice throughout the residential. And it will be very purposeful and useful. Also, for those who are taking the course for 3 credits, if you stay with me on this pedagogy, you'll be well on your way. towards getting your third credit. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. Got to click a few buttons here. Someday when I meet the president of Zoom, I'm going to ask him, why must I click so many buttons? But here we are. Let's begin with a private free write. Again, no prompt, whatever language. Put your pen to your paper, or if you don't have pen and paper, write on your laptop. If you can't think of what to write, then try, I don't know what to write. I'm baffled. Vietnam is baffling, but I'm intrigued. I want to answer these questions while there. And at that point, you're already writing. And then continue writing and don't stop until I say so. So, begin. 10 more seconds. And stop. All right, thank you. This exercise is also one of the building blocks of liberal arts and science education. The ability for you to pause, clear your mind, clear your thoughts, and just prepare for an immersion in study for the next 90 minutes. So thank you for following along with this important step. I just put this up here as a reminder of the parable that we started with last week. And the reminder that I want to stress is that there is never a simple lesson to a parable. It's not an allegory. The purpose of a simple story, which is part of a parable, is for you to step into each person's shoes in that story. So to think of it from the perspective, not just of a very poor farmer, but also think of this story through the eyes and by wearing the shoes of one of the strangers who stops and gives advice, and not just one, but another and then another. All right. You can even put yourself into the shoes of the piece of wood that's being carved and carved and carved until it's just a bunch of little pieces of wood. So, important thing about a parable, and in your reading for our third Zoom session, you'll have another parable that comes from Bangladesh. And the person who shares that parable actually won the Nobel Prize in economics. So a tremendously good storyteller and parable teller, and a tremendous economist. And again, this is Southeast Asia. Vietnam is in the middle of 11 countries. East Timor is the second newest state on Earth. South Sudan is the newest, but prior to that, it's East Timor. In 2001, it became independent of Indonesia, and it became independent, as did Indonesia, of Portugal sooner than that. We talked about this last week, what makes up ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And it started as a US State Department and Defense Department project to fight communism. But it has changed so very radically since those early days of an anti-communist purpose. It is now 10, and with adding East Timor, it'll be 11 states that deal with serious stuff, which is the right side of this slide. And we'll be looking at a number of those issues in the course of a couple of weeks in Vietnam, all of which are on the agenda of ASEAN. And here's that pre-modern picture of Southeast Asia. So long before there are states, in some cases before there are kingdoms, there are tribes and there are regions that are under the influence of different cultures. So the Champa region is part of Vietnam, and that had a Hindu influence and was related to Angkor Wat, which was both Buddhism and Hinduism, which is in present day Cambodia. But where we will be in the Mekong Delta, if you look right in the middle of the screen, and I'm moving my cursor around a brown part of the map there, Funan. We'll be spending a couple of nights in Lom Xuyen. And Lom Xuyen is the capital city of Anyang province, and Anyang province used to be the heart of a very extensive kingdom of Funan, which radiated across all of this maritime territory in trade long before the Europeans arrived. All that is left of Funan now are a couple of crumbling buildings and some archaeological digs. Why? Because successive waves of colonizers destroyed Funan, and nature destroyed Funan. The Mekong Delta, which starts way up here in the Himalayas in Tibet and comes through all of these countries. This is the Mekong River. And by the time it gets down here to Vietnam, by the time it gets here to Vietnam, there are 9 fingers of that river that empty out into what Vietnam calls the East Sea. You'll see here on the map that James Rush, who published the book, calls it the South China Sea. That's what China calls it. That's what China calls it. But Vietnam calls it the East Sea. The Philippines calls it the West Sea for obvious reasons. But the reason that Vietnam and the Philippines call it the East and West Sea is to emphasize this is not China's sea. This is not the South China Sea. I was at a conference in Hanoi sponsored by CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA. And it was teaching international law to future diplomats in Hanoi. And they provided a book, which was about 300 pages long. And inside the book, and this was the material for a week-long workshop, inside the front cover was a map of this region. And on that map, it called this body of water the South China Sea. So what do you think happened? Before the conference started, all of the books and notepads and pens were laid at each person's place on the tables for the workshop. The organizer, the Vietnamese organizer, the government of Vietnam, went to each place, left the pen and the paper, took the books off the tables, and had all of the books destroyed because the map said South China Sea. And what Vietnam, past and present, is intent on making known is that it has its own definition for things, and it will not allow any outsider or any ideology to define who or what Vietnam is. Okay, so we'll see a little bit of Funan, but just as an archaeological dig, and you won't see any other evidence of Funan. But what you will see is a Mekong Delta, which is always in flux. This area of dirt, this is dirt that comes all the way from Tibet. This dirt grows and recedes, expands and falls back, ebbs and flows. The exact same thing can be said of the Red River Delta, which is up here where Hanoi is. So the capital of Vietnam, ancient Vietnam, has moved in and out to stay out of the water. And all of Hanoi is basically below sea level because it's really where water once was. All right, the concept that Rush introduced and that we talked about briefly 2 weeks ago is his concept of mandala. A mandala is something that radiates out from a center. So those red dots are the center of trading and tribal kingdoms that go back long, long before the age of colonialism. And they didn't have strict territorial lines, but those mandalas of influence, be it the Anger influence here in Cambodia or the Hindu Champa culture that's in present day central Vietnam, or what I'm working with now is the Burman mandala in what is present day Myanmar. They didn't have strict territorial lines, but these mandalas pushed up against each other and made relations. Sometimes they fought, but generally they didn't. They traded an enormous amount. What you'll notice about all of these kingdoms, including Angkor Wat, which is in the middle of the Mekong River system, all of them are thessalocracies. That is, they are forms of gathering people based on seafaring trade. All of them are about trade, especially this one right here, the ancient mandala of Malacca, which is present-day Singapore, the Straits of Malacca. Okay, that's pre-colonialism, and the second half of Rush that I asked for you to read for today introduces colonialism and imperialism, whose reality counts. And how long-lasting is the legacy of colonialism and imperialism? So long before there were European, Southeast Asia had extensive trade. There were empires. There were sometimes fights and contentions among those mandalas. But at that time, for the most part, neither India to the west nor China to the north overpowered those mandalas of Southeast Asia. True, China did have a tribute system with Vietnam for 900 years. Vietnam had to pay a tax and send an ambassador to China. However, as China keeps its scorecard and Vietnam keeps its scorecard, there's a very interesting thing that you see in the history books. Vietnam says the score is 11-0. Vietnam has defended itself successfully 11 times against China trying to push south into Vietnam. So it even counts as a victory in the scorecard that 900, almost a full millennium of time when Vietnam was paying tribute to China. That takes us up to the 16th century. And the Portuguese are the first to arrive in 1511, then the Spaniards, then the Dutch, then the French, then the British, then the Americans, then the Soviets. All right. And I have a couple of dates there for the French. The French first arrived in 1658 with Jesuit missionaries. And, just a handful of Jesuits changed so much in the country because they changed the alphabet and they introduced a different way of learning and teaching in the capital, and it altered how the people that were serving the Vietnamese emperor were trained. Then they arrived 200 years after that with gunboats and cannons and created Indochine, a 5-part colonization of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. The Americans arrived in Southeast Asia in 2 waves. 1898, we colonized the Philippines, and we didn't give up our colonization of the Philippines until World War II. Then we shifted our interest over to the mainland, and we were very actively supporting French recolonization of Vietnam from 1945 to 1954. We covered 75% of the cost post-World War II of France's recolonization of Vietnam. And when France failed at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, then the Americans moved in, first with advisors, but then upwards of 500,000 soldiers at a time. That American presence lasted till 1975, and we'll look at a couple of spots in Ho Chi Minh City of that last day of American military presence in Vietnam in April 1975. As soon as the Americans were out in 1975, the Soviets entered. Okay, we'll get into that once we're on the streets of Ho Chi Minh City. But the point here is to note that there was really extensive, well-developed civilization, trade, relations between different mandalas of power before Europeans arrived. And that first paragraph describes a level of sophistication and cultivation superior, so much more developed than anything in Europe at that time. But the Europeans started mastering how to build ships, and then they started becoming expert at how to mount guns and cannons on those ships, and they came and they colonized madly. So the high point of that colonization was the 19th to 20th centuries of white supremacy in Southeast Asia. Couple of examples, and we'll look at these examples on the streets of Vietnam. France had a civilizing ambition for Vietnam. It wanted it to be the pearl of the Orient. So it sent its artists, it sent its architects, it even commissioned Gustave Eiffel and his architectural firm and sent them to Vietnam for 17 years to create a new form of architecture, Euro-Asian fusion. And we still see some of those buildings in Ho Chi Minh City. Many more of those buildings are up in Hanoi, but we'll see some important ones there in Ho Chi Minh City. Another influence, the Kennedy family. The family, not the US government, but Joseph Kennedy and then Jack Kennedy had an ambition to Catholicize Vietnam, which at that point was nearly entirely Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian. Those three religions in tandem, and that's called Dam Yao, T-A-M-G-I-A-O, Dam Yao. And then another example is the Dutch East India Company. The governor of the Dutch East India Company was very different. He wasn't interested in art or architecture or sharing a religion. He had one motive, and that motive was money. So here you've got a governor living in Indonesia, and he controls an archipelago through guns and slavery that was 46 times larger than the country that he sailed from. Can you imagine? Where does somebody get the hubris to think that you can control something 50 times bigger than your home country? And the question that I repeat here is, whose reality counts? So, of these colonizers, some missionized. There were Jesuits, there were Dominicans, there were Baptists. Others, in fact, all of them seriously militarized. Some were genocidal. There's no question that the Dutch were very genocidal. They wiped out whole populations in Indonesia. All of them sought to monopolize trade. They weren't interested in fair terms of trade. They wanted a monopoly. And some were geopolitical. That was more the American agenda, was geopolitics. They wanted to control the Straits of Malacca and east-west traffic from Korea, Japan, Taiwan, all the way across what the Chinese call the South China Sea, what the Vietnamese call the East Sea, what the Philippines calls the West Sea, through the Straits of Malacca to India, to the Middle East, to Europe. That was the US ambition. And what was it all for? What was the treasure? Spice, rubber, tobacco, petroleum, palm oil, fruit, tea, coffee, rice, sugar. Rubber again, gold, gems, timber, opium, silk, slaves, huge slave trade thanks to the Dutch, taxes, sea lanes, hegemony, and I think a good measure of pride. There was pride of place. Which of these European powers was going to put its imprint on Southeast Asia? So I'm going to pause. I see that there is a new chat there. Let me just see what that chat's about. What is hegemony? Great. Thanks, Grace, for putting that there. Hegemony is where you seek to simultaneously impose cultural, military, and economic might. Cultural, economic, and military might, all three of them together. And the US sought to do that. The US largely still seeks to do that in great measure in many places of the earth. And we expend enormous amounts of money to maintain our hegemony. That's why we have the world's largest military, the US Army, and we have the world's second largest military, the Air Force, the world's third largest military, the Navy, and it goes on and on. We have 158 military bases scattered across the globe. That's hegemony. And it's not just the military. It's to open up trade for capitalist flow, neoliberalism. And look at the airwaves. Look what youth in any of your countries listen to. So much of it is media that transmits from the US or is influenced by the US. That and K-pop and J-pop music from Korea and Japan. But Taylor Swift is number one. Any other questions on that colonial imprint? The big question to take away from that is, what is the lasting impact? What is the legacy of colonialism and imperialism? And what is the difference between those two? This came out in some of the questions that you posted in the forum, and I have a whole slide with your questions, so we'll hit them. But what is the difference between colonialism and imperialism? Does anybody have a take on that? It is one of the themes of the Rush book that you should have read through by now. When you colonize, you put both feet firmly planted on that territory, and you extract timber or things that are mined or slaves you extract from that country, but you are there, you're planted there, you build an infrastructure. The British built schools and hospitals, they laid train tracks, they built roads. It's very expensive to colonize. It's a huge investment. And then you ship from Britain, for instance, to India, or French shipped from France. The Eiffel architectural firm to Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, to be there in place, building things that are French. That's colonization. So it's not just taking out. Colonization is planting yourself right there and making yourself known and enforcing your ways. So back to the question, whose reality counts? In colonization, it's the colonizer's reality that counts. When you're reading M by Gim Twee, whose reality counts on that rubber plantation in the first couple of vignettes? French rubber plantation. The resolve is not the French resolve to have a rubber plantation. They enslaved hundreds of thousands of people to care for those trees. And it's such, ask anybody at Future Generations who works on tapping maple trees for syrup, right? You have to do it precisely right. You've got to do it at the right angle. You've got to do it at the right depth. You have to do it at the right time to get that precious stuff. Mike Recklin, says this is more precious than oil, what comes out of the maple trees in West Virginia. But you can destroy the tree by tapping a little bit too deeply or doing it at the wrong time of year. So the resolve of the French to colonize, that's one thing. But the resolve of the people that are enslaved, the coolies, the corvée labor, to keep up the ambition of colonizers is enormous. So whose reality counts? Imperialism is different. Imperialism is where the economy of an industrialized country has grown beyond its bounds, and it needs new people to buy its goods. So you force upon other countries shipments and purchase of what you have. That's cheaper than colonization. But both of them have profound lasting impacts and legacies on colonized and imperialized countries. And all of Southeast Asia was affected by colonization and imperialism. Thailand, one of the 11 countries of Southeast Asia, always likes to raise its hand and say, we were not colonized, but they were imperialized. They were militarized. They were controlled by the Japanese for a period of time, and most definitely by the US. So never colonized, but very much imperialized. Okay, any questions from that part of James Rush? If not, we'll plow forward. And we will get to a point where I'll stop talking and you're going to be speaking and you're going to be doing some writing. So here's the next part of Rush. This is the second half of Rush. The first half was taking us halfway through the book, and this is the second half of the book. When you're colonized or imperialized, it is downright humiliating. It's awful. You live your whole life according to some other countries, some foreigners, some strangers' ambition for you. Not you personally, but what you as a human can help them generate in terms of extracted goods, mined items, timbered items, cultivated fruit, whatever. But it's humiliating because you have no control. It's not your reality that counts. So out of that comes a struggle for nationalism, and then revolution, and then independence. And then after independence, the question is, what capacity does a post-colonial, a post-imperialized country have to be an independent state, to stand on its own 2 feet? So legitimacy in these colonies, so we're talking about before 1945, falls upon those groups that are able to subvert and erase the Euro-American presence in Southeast Asia. European first, European, then American second. And while there are competing nationalist narratives going on in those colonies, especially leading up to and during World War II, the independence movements are sustained in all 11 countries, including Thailand, of Southeast Asia. All of those movements are sustained by whichever entity has the strongest ability to organize indigenous people. So in Myanmar, it was Buddhism. In Indonesia, it was Islam. In the Philippines, it was Catholicism. In Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, it was communism. In Brunei, it was an autocrat. Or in present-day Myanmar, it is the militarists. Whoever's got the organizing principles on how to hold together so many disparate people against the overwhelming power of a colonizer, those are the people who lead the nationalist movements. And they come up with a narrative. They come up with a story as to why they need to be independent and who they are. What is their culture? What is their ambition? Whose reality counts? So this is all going on in the early part of the 20th century, and even the latter part of the 19th century. And it's making very good progress. And World War II was an inflection point where a lot of Southeast Asia was ready to claim independence. And then Japan does its own form of imperialism on the entire region, and it's called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And while it was a Pan-Asian set of goals, it was brutal. It was catastrophic. It killed so many people. 2 million people died of starvation because of Japanese co-prosperity stuff in the north of Vietnam in the 1940s. 2 million people. A big chunk of people. It was brutal, and it delayed the independence of Southeast Asian countries until after World War II, and in some cases, well after World War II. So here's another piece of irony. So, if you look back to what we were talking about earlier, what did these countries look like before the colonizers arrived? They looked like this. They weren't states. The idea of a state, that's a European idea. That was an invention of Europe, to have this thing called a state. Came out of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to resolve a long-standing war between the religions of Europe. That wasn't an Asian idea. But coming out of World War II, the other thing that comes out of World War II is the UN framework to keep peace so that there's not World War III, and to keep peace in a Europe, American, Canadian kind of way. Keep states at peace with one another. So coming out of World War II, all of these Southeast Asian countries had to become modern day states. They had to change governance. They had to build a different kind of capacity. They had to alter their education system. They had to change their monetary system, their trade system, in order to fit a UN framework of statehood. Then on top of that, boom, the Cold War. And all of Southeast Asia had to pick a side. Some of them chose to be non-aligned, but all of them really had to be with the Soviets or with the Americans. And go back to that picture that I showed you, that slide we had of ASEAN. This is the Cold War. So the anti-communism of both CETO, FPDA is the Five Power Defense Agreement. That was the British version of CETO for Southeast Asia. The NAM is the non-aligned movement. So that was a meager effort of part of Southeast Asia to be neither Soviet nor American in allegiance. But it takes a lot of work to climb out of the deep hole deficit of being colonized or being part of somebody's legacy of imperialism. It's a deep hole to climb out of, to be an independent, capable, functioning, modern day state. So I say here in just very brief summary of what James Rush talks about in his book, there are big obstacles that they overcame. Yet, of the 11 Southeast Asian countries, all of them today are trending towards something more stable, capable, and sovereign. The slight exception to that is Myanmar, because it is still under a fairly brutal military junta. But it has had periods of time, and it has had decades since World War II, when it's been much more liberal and free in its governance. One thing to note, and this is a very, very important thing to note about not just Vietnam, but all of Southeast Asia. Almost all of the states of Southeast Asia are one-party states. One party. So in the Philippines, it's the PAP. For a long time in Malaysia, it was the UMNO. In Myanmar, it's the Tatmadaw. In Thailand, it's the monarch. These are one-party states. On the one hand, they're corporatist, and they're authoritarian. Possibly like Malaysia and Indonesia, they are anocratic. So let me explain those three very important terms. And this plays so importantly into Bending Bamboo and what the 11 graduates of the Future Generations educational project, where they applied seed scale to try to create a template, a prototype of modern education in the Mekong Delta. What are they leaning up against? What must they abide by? What rules must they follow in order to be really progressive, innovative, creative educators? Well, the context is they are in a one-party state, and that is the Communist Party of Vietnam. 2, it is a form of corporatism whereby the party creates all of the social organizations that people belong to. So if you're a peasant, you're part of the Farmers Association. If you're a lawyer, you're part of the Lawyers Association. If you're a young kid, you're part of the Young Pioneers. If you're a woman, you're part of the Women's Organization. Everybody gets their feed, their drip line of nutrient from the one party on what the goals of the country, what the lessons of the country are through corporatism. So you can't go out and just create your own separate social organization. You can't go create a non-governmental organization. In Vietnam, the law of non-governmental organizations applies to international NGOs because there are not domestic NGOs. You belong to corporatism, right? So if you're a teacher, you have to follow what the one-party state says you can do on your high school campus or on your middle school campus or in your preschool. The second thing of one-party statism is generally it is authoritarian. Authoritarian means that all the power really resides in that party, whatever that party is. And it might be a Democratic Party, it might be a Republican Party, it might be a Communist Party, it might be an Islamic Party, but authoritarianism is where the power resides in a single party. So you don't have gridlock or competition between competing ideas at the national level on the direction of where you're going to go. So again, Vietnam. Under that authoritarian one-party system, the prime minister is in charge of all the ministries. One of those ministries is the Ministry of Education and Training, MOET. MOET is in charge of every single piece of paper of curriculum for 63 provinces of Vietnam. So in Gan Ta, where our teachers are, they have to follow what MOET allows. That's authoritarianism. So their challenge with Seed Scale is, how do we, as educators, work with hundreds of other educators through workshops and through online sessions? And we had 65,000 hours of received education given to teachers through workshops that the Gan Ta group participated in. All of that still had to be with the blessing of the authoritarian ministry in Hanoi, the Ministry of Education and Training. Anocratic is, say, the Philippines or Indonesia or Singapore, where you have a mix of authoritarian autocracy and some democratic attributes. That's not Vietnam. Okay? None of these 11 countries of Southeast Asia are liberal regimes. And that really does have an effect on what kind of education can occur. Okay? There was a lot in that last paragraph, so I'm going to jump out and see if you have any questions. And I need some coffee.
I have a question. What do you think their education, like, what do you think of it? Is it, I mean, I know it's all run by the government, but is it good?
Is it good? What do you mean by good? That's quite a fuzzy metric.
Well, I was just asking what you think of it.
Well, let me go back to the earlier question. Whose reality counts? I can tell you what I think of it, but I don't think that's the most important question. What do they think of how their education is unfolding? Not what does Dan Wester think? Not what does Grace think? Right? So I'm not trying to embarrass me or you. I'm just reiterating a really important question that goes back hundreds of years to that pre-colonial time. Whose reality counts? All right. So in the current education system, MOET, because it's a one-party state, it is flat out corrupt. Okay, so that's not just my impression, that's a fact. And there are people from MOET who are sitting in prison because they were too corrupt, right? There are people during COVID-19 from the Ministry of Health who are sitting in prison because they were way too corrupt. And when you have a one-party system, there is a tendency for things to get out of hand. Things get out of hand in a 2 or a 3-party system too, but in a one-party system, where are your checks and balances? So back to the question, what kind of education system do you have? All right, think of it while you're there, not as a snapshot. I'm going to take a picture of the education in Vietnam and I'm going to say it's good or bad. Don't do it that way. Think instead of a motion picture a movie on a reel that's long and interesting. Liz and I, my wife and I, we had the first visas for Europeans, Americans, Canadians to live in the south of Vietnam after the American War. 1990. Our visas, if you're having trouble getting a visa, our visas had to be signed off by the Politburo of the Communist Party in Hanoi. Each member of the Politburo signed our visa. And Dr. Sun, who is in charge of the Bending Bamboo Project, but boy, has he been through health issues this year, including a month-long coma. He was the one who walked our passports, our papers, to Hanoi. And you couldn't even fly to Hanoi. He had to take a 3-day train trip to get up to Hanoi to show the people the paperwork, to get red stamps. So in that system, there was such tight control and poverty and degradation of a post-colonial state trying to climb out of that hole that I was describing. In 1990, the educational system was bankrupt. Bankrupt. When we arrived at Gunta University, which thanks to 2 of our students, we'll be allowed to go to, which means if you haven't given Chris your passport information, do that today. Because to and the they will need a full month to get permission from their administration for us to go on their campus. Okay? And so they have to show, you know, this is Jean-Pierre, this is Grace, this is Gautry. They've got to show that to their authorities for us to have permission to go in the gate. So we'll go in the gate. But on that campus in 1990, it was bankrupt. There was no library. There was 1 computer on the campus. There was 1 VCR machine and 1 television. There were no grants. The teachers in our department earned $200 a year for full-time work for 50 weeks a year. They raised pigs, they made chalk by hand, we painted the walls black so we had blackboards. So think of this moving picture. That's 1990. 2023, you're gonna be blown away by what that campus is now. It's got 50,000 students. When we started Bending Bamboo with Dr. Sun, it's about when Future Generations started. So how many students does Future Generations have? Dr. Sun's campus, Nam Gunta University, has 20,000 students in that same period of time. So think of this moving picture. What do they think of their education? They think it's awesome because look at what we had and now look at what we have. This moving picture is flat out awesome. And yet it's deficient. It's not good enough. And that's why the Gunta 11 had a seed scale project to propose to MOET, the Ministry of Education and Training. Here's a prototype of how we would like to do language curriculum based on sustainability, resilience, equity, and inclusivity. Those 4 things. And they put those 4 words on the cover of their prototype. And you know what? MOET did not like that because of 2 words: equity and inclusivity. Who outside of the Communist Party in a 1-party autocratic state has the audacity to say, we're going to teach about equity and inclusivity? Geez, that's the role of the party. Thank you very much. So back to the drawing board. Take out the offensive language. And I'll show you some other examples in the prototype of pages that had to be torn out for what you might think is completely innocuous, but not from the perspective of the party, which has taken a country from Japanese imperialism, French colonialism, and all of that stuff. The American War. All right, we'll talk about that in 2 weeks, but just, spoiler alert, the American War, Vietnam is the size of Colorado. I live in Colorado. Colorado has 5 million people. Vietnam has 100 million people, 20 times the population. But in the American War, we dropped on a country the size of Colorado 7 times the tonnage of ammunition of all of World War II. Asia, Africa, Europe, all of it combined, 7 times that is what we dropped on Vietnam. So from the perspective of the ministry in Hanoi, their decision on education counts more than really innovative, really risky seed scale effort by 11 teachers down in Gan Ta, Vietnam. Put it in perspective. So things go at a different pace. Things go at a different pace, and you got to figure out, well, how do we do this dance? We have to do this dance because we live in this context. This is our enabling environment. Key term, enabling environment. They're not going to change the government in Hanoi. That's not their purpose. They're not going to change the Department of Ed in their province. That's not their goal. But how can we educate in a better way in this enabling environment? The one-party autocratic state in Southeast Asia with its imperial past. How do we do it? That, Grace, is how you can begin to answer good, great, I'm blown away, right? So you got to find the right metric and you got to put it in that context. Okay. Thank you. Got a half hour left, so I want to keep moving. Actually, I wish we had an hour, but we'll deal with what we got. So let's talk about M. What a completely different way and a refreshing way of looking at this same place, this same sweep of history, but now through a novella. Okay? You've read the first half for today's class. You'll read the second half for our meeting in 2 weeks. What did you perceive? And I want you to do a 5-minute focused free write this time. Focused free write is different than what you did at the beginning of class. That was a private free write where I gave you no guidance. But I want you to write for 5 minutes on this question, this prompt. How are you affected by the flow of characters, the intensity of relations, the traumatic events, the sweep of Vietnamese history that you learned about in this novella, M? So put your pen to the paper, write for 5 minutes without stopping. Don't lift your pen off the paper. Keep it moving, and I'll tell you when 5 minutes is up. So begin. And at this time, write in English. Write in English. Begin. One more minute. Keep writing for one more minute and then draw your thought to a close. And stop, please. Look at what you've just written. And now with your pen, bracket, underscore, highlight something that you wrote. Not all of it. Something that you're happy with, you're pleased with that you wrote. Draw a line under that, bracket it. And now I'd like to go around the room and I'll ask each of you to just read the portion that you bracketed, not your whole writing, just what you bracketed. And this is important. Only read what you wrote. Don't add any more words and don't edit. Your brain is doing something very, very special when it writes. And when you're speaking off the top of your head, it's coming from a different part of your brain. We don't want that part right now. So let me call on you one at a time. And Grace, let me start with you. Just read loudly for us a portion of what you wrote.
I didn't bracket mine yet. Give me 10 seconds.
You've got it.
Okay. The
Go for
author
it.
has a poetic way of moving us through their actions, which gives us a glimpse into their minds instead of directly telling us their thoughts and emotions.
Okay, great. So an indirect glimpse, not didactic preaching. Great, thank you. John, can you share what you wrote and only what you wrote? I'll come back to John. Gowrie, can you share what you wrote?
Yes. War, sorry. War itself an awful incident one never wished for. However, Vietnamese people faced for several years, and this is itself the traumatized, losing near and dear, leaving your family and escape from their country.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful, thank you. Robert, are you able to speak in your context? All right, possibly not. Emma Bet, will you read what you wrote?
Okay, yes. Impressed for the impact of Ward's character of deep emotional complexity within the author of AM, and as well as the mother of kids which carries their child in the jungle.
Okay, good. Just the burden, the trauma of carrying a child in the jungle during war. Rachel, can you read what you wrote? Okay, we're batting 50%, Chris. So either we need stronger internet or something. When I do free writing exercise, I need 100% buy-in. John, go ahead, please. You're muted. Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. About mine, it is about the European colonialism in Vietnam that the Vietnamese try to stop, but they cannot manage because of the weapon capacity that the Europeans have, which lead to the brutal killing of the Vietnamese people when they were resistant to the European colonialism. So in these things are related to how the Africans were colonized when the European came in form of missionaries, then they start grabbing land. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So drawing largely on what Rush was talking about, but in M's case, the poetry, the glimpse into their minds, feeling what it's like to be a mother carrying a child or being a nanny carrying an orphan through a rubber plantation, where that child has just seen parents killed. All right. So through what you've shared through your writing, the four of you, and thank you very much. We begin to open up responsively to Kim Thuy's novella. In that first 70 pages or so that I assigned for today, we're introduced page by page to a new vignette of masters, coolies, gangai. Gangai means daughter, but it also means prostitute. So the master has a gangai. There are revolutionaries. The gangai is a revolutionary who falls in love and then gives birth to a child. Alexandra and Mai have a child, Dam. And then on that rubber plantation is an insurrection where almost everybody dies, but Dam is orphaned and she is ferreted away, carried through the rubber plantation. It's not a forest. A rubber plantation doesn't look like a forest at all because every tree is planted in a row. It's agribusiness. Okay, it's not natural. But a nanny, a surrogate parent, pulls this orphan away and saves her and takes her to My Lai, her ancestral village in the central part of Vietnam. And she meets extended relatives of that nanny, whose name we don't even know. It's just a surrogate parent nanny, who then raises money by selling grilled corn on the streets of Saigon so that Dam, the orphan, can attend a French lycée in Saigon. It was called Saigon then, not Ho Chi Minh City. And then during a school break, the nanny takes M back up to My Lai to see relatives again. And it's the story of the My Lai massacre, which we'll talk about. And it was devastating. That was an inflection point in the American War. But there at that massacre, the nanny is killed. Most of the villagers are killed. Dam survives because she's hiding underneath other corpses of people from the village that have been massacred. And a helicopter pilot becomes her savior and scoops her out of it and gets her back into an orphanage where she can be taken care of. And then later, miraculously, somehow, serendipitously, they meet each other again and they become lovers. But then that soldier, that helicopter pilot, has to go back into battle and they never see each other again, even though she waits for 3 years to get his letters to hear from him. He's been dead for 3 years, but she keeps thinking, he'll write, he'll write, he'll write. He's dead. So she becomes a prostitute, not because that's her calling in life, but that's her only way to find food. And among the prostitutes, she meets Louis, who's named after Louis Armstrong, but he's also called Miden, which means Black American. So he is a product of what's happening there at the brothel with the American soldier, a Black soldier, and a prostitute, Miden, some of the most discriminated against people in the country. But Louis has a profession. He can make money as a professional beggar, and there are very good beggars. There are also extremely good pickpockets. So I will give you warning on how to behave on the streets, especially when you're changing money, so that you can keep your money. And then they meet Mamala, Pan Am Mamala, Pamela, who has her ways of trying to solve the problems of Saigon and the orphans that are on the street. I'm going to take you to the very park, which used to be called John F. Kennedy Square, right in the middle of Saigon, where all the beggars and the orphans, especially the Mi-Den, the colored offspring of American soldiers, congregated and lived in the open for years, for a decade, before they could be resettled. And then we meet Naomi and Home, others that are part of that network of people that are trying to survive, So let's go back to Grace's question. What's good? If you're looking at this as a moving picture to where we are today, you're going to be so blown away. But still, the questions are equally difficult. How does somebody not in the party of a one-party authoritarian state introduce change and monitor and investigate and test whether or not that change is good? And the last thing in the part that I gave you to read for today is a bonze, a Buddhist monk, on a very busy street in the middle of Saigon, in the middle of the American War, lighting himself on fire, the self-immolation of the bonze. That was another turning point of the war. All of that is just 70 pages of very quick reading, right? If it weren't laid out the way she lays it out, it probably could squeeze into 15 pages. But that's a lot of history. French colonialism, imperialism, the American War, people from all these different stripes of life. What is it about this novella? What is it about the story that Kim Thuy is trying to tell us? All of these people, what's their relationship? Their story is so blended, so fluid, so closely related, but what is that relationship that they had? Let me put my screen back on for just a short bit. Let's see. Okay, let's do another focused free write. We'll do it for 3 minutes, just 3 minutes in English, and then you'll bracket, and then I'll ask you to share. But what sensation do you feel as you follow Thuy's portrait of Vietnam? What is the sensation? Don't describe any of the characters. Write for 3 minutes about the feeling inside of you as you look at this portraiture. Begin. 1 more minute. And stop. Bracket something good of what you wrote. Maybe a line, maybe 2 lines, maybe 1 word. And we'll go around the room real quickly. Tell me what you bracketed. Emma-Beth, tell us what you bracketed. You're muted if you're trying to speak. All right, let me move on. Gowrie. Okay, Emma-Beth, you're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. I feel that Vietnam switched stage under the colonized of European countries, and nowadays it has a greater assets naturally, and the human energy who can be changed more.
Okay, thanks. Gowrie, what sensation did you feel?
My mind went totally blank on that, but the grief and sorrow, sorry, angry, and long betrayed while going through it this um, in the few of the parts.
Okay,
So I don't know how I couldn't write it properly, yeah, but I just pointed out how my sentence went. Like it was full of griefness, sorrow, sorry, angry with what's happening over there, and the long breath, sometimes full of tears. So those are my sensations.
that's wonderful. That is a sensation that you sense something full of tears.
Mm.
Can you see how different that writing is than our earlier talk today about James Rush and colonization and all that history stuff? It's completely different when Gowrie writes a few words, as hard as it is, about the sensation she feels. Grace, what did you write?
Gripping and heart-wrenching, terrifying and hopeful, rooting for the characters while knowing and anticipating the tragedies all at once.
Beautiful, awesome. You capture a lot there. John, what did you write?
Mine is just only once, Vietnamese revolutions.
Revolution or pollution?
Revolutions.
Okay.
As they have been in a different resistance, like against China, and then now they were colonized by different European countries.
Okay.
Then
We
later
know
on
that.
the US
We
chipped
read
in.
James Rush. We know about colonization. Tell me about a feeling inside of you. What sensation do you feel? What emotion do you have in response to the story M? What's the feeling here? Not what's the history here. Okay, so It's a very different question. It's a completely different metric. And do we have Rachel? Can you tell us what sensation you feel reading M? And Robert, are you able to join us? Okay. All right. Let me close out. We have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to close out in a response to questions you have. Thank you for those of you who posted promptly on your one-on-one, and Chris is going to give you a new one-on-one following this forum. And I think there'll be a one-on-one-on-one because 3 of you will meet. And the importance of this, I cannot understate. You need to be thinking as a group and traveling and learning and sharing and asking questions as a group. We're not a tourist group. You are studying and learning alongside colleagues. So do take the one-on-one session very seriously in the coming week. And don't save it for the last minute. So I made a list here of the questions that you had in your forum. And we have only 1 minute. So what I will do is I will enter into today's forum later today, and I'll respond point by point to each of the questions that you asked. But let me jump to the bottom because there was a little anxiety with, let's see, I think it was Grace asking about the airport. There will be somebody there to pick you up. Yep, it's more than likely going to be me holding a sign. And if it's not my pretty face, it'll be Chris. Late arrival, that's not going to be a late departure, I should say. I'm sorry. I think, Grace, you were asking, what if we arrive early or if we arrive late? And what if we want to stay beyond the 14th? So once we have your airline information about your arrival, if you are coming ahead of the 2nd, I'll work with you, or Chris will work with you, and we'll see if we can get you a room at the same guest house where we're going to be staying the night of the 2nd, the night of the 3rd in Ho Chi Minh City. And the address for that is right there, Asia Ruby Center Point Hotel on Mak Boy Street in Ho Chi Minh City. It will be easy to put into the system if you want to stay there after the 14th. So the night of the 14th, 15th, 16th, however long you want to stay. But we want to make that reservation now, not wait until when we're there in Ho Chi Minh City. Your accommodations are going to be different from place to place, but good. In fact, in some cases, really good. And there are a couple of reasons for it. In Ho Chi Minh City, I've stayed at this same guest house 100 times. And it's centrally located. We can walk to so many important things. It's not too expensive. It's not too fancy. They have a great breakfast. That's why I chose Mak Boy Street. Okay. In Can Tho, we're at a completely different kind of place. It's a boutique guest house run by a family, and they have 2 buildings next door to each other. Half of us will be in one building, half of us will be next door. But the address is the Lighthouse on Hai Ba Jung Street in Dan An, Ning Q, Hang Pho, Can Tho. If you are on the website filling out your e-visa application, there is a question, and I'm going to put this in the same, or I'm going to have Chris handle this, I think. There is a question there as to what your ultimate destination is. You can put down Trans Mekong Lighthouse Hotel. We'll be there for 6 days, and it's on the wharf, it's on the water, it's on the Mekong River, and it's right above the fish market and the vegetable market. There's noise outside your window. There's an old woman who sells the best grilled stuff right there on the corner. It's cool. And we'll have a couple of days.
And just to say, in the instructions I sent out, I told everyone to use the Asia Ruby Center Point Hotel as the address because that's the first one.
Right. So, and on the application, the first time that they ask for an address, that's perfect. There is a second question at the end of the visa application where it asks what your, the name of the company and agency. No, I'm sorry. It asks, what is the hosting organization? We don't have one.
Right.
So for that question, did you have them enter Asian Ruby?
No, because that was not a required field.
Okay.
So
So
I
we
just
could,
would like leave
you're
that
right.
blank.
You're absolutely right. What we could put in there, if you want to, if you haven't done your application, you can put in Transmekong. They are recognized by the party, and they're in the business of receiving foreigners. Okay. Then we'll have a couple of days in Lum Swin, and there are different things to learn in that province, which isn't too far away from Ganta, also on the Mekong River. So we'll be in and out of riverboats, on the water, on the land. And then the last 2 nights in the Mekong Delta, in the far south, will be at the Victoria Hotel, which is lovely. Bring your swimsuit. They've got a nice pool. And the reason for that is you will know by that point in time the layout of Ganta. You'll be able to walk and explore and get lost and find your way back. But you'll also have the comfort of staying in a place where you'll have space and privacy so that you can collect your thoughts, do some writing, plan your third credit if you're doing that. Talk with me, talk with Chris, and get that well on its way. So I chose the Victoria because of its proximity to Ganta, where you can walk around and do things, where our Ganta 11 on their own time can meet with you. But also it's very comfortable. All 3 places, the Asia Ruby, the Transmekong Lighthouse, and the Victoria, are accustomed to receiving people from around the world. So it doesn't matter what country, what color skin, it doesn't matter who we are. We'll fit in those places. Lom Swin will be different. That's a smaller city. It's much more provincial. And we're in a family-run guest house there, the Lara Hotel, but comfortable. All of the places, all the accommodations, you'll have Wi-Fi, you'll have clean drinking water. Don't worry about that. You'll have fabulous food. And I saw in one of the postings that somebody might apply for a student visa. Do not, because you're not going to a Vietnamese educational institution. So you can't have a student visa if you're not going to a Vietnamese educational system. All right.
Again, please follow the directions that I sent out. You are a tourist. Do not apply. Do not apply for anything other than a tourist visa.
Amen. Thanks. Yeah, I just saw that in the forum early this morning. It was one of the late postings. So in preparation for our 3rd session, read and ponder the selections. There's a short 2-page parable. There is a very important conclusion to the story of M. And then I've given you a passage from George Black's book, The Long Reckoning. You're going to want to know what's in that George Black reading, because the head of the Mekong Environmental Forum, his family was affected directly by the exact thing that George Black is describing in his chapter. So do read that, and we'll talk about it in detail. Do your one-on-one or your one-on-one-on-one if there are 3 of you. Post promptly, sooner the better, on the forum. I was able to read everything, but I got up at 4 o'clock this morning in order to capture late postings to the forum. So it'll be a great favor to me if you can do that sooner, not later. Process your visa. Please continue private free writing. Get in the habit of it. We'll do more of it, and we'll do focused writing. And let me know your questions. I will put in the forum later today an answer to the questions that you saw on that one slide. And I see several chats. So before we adjourn, let me just look. Okay, so Chris's point, flight and travel plans, yes. Even sooner than that, today, send Chris, and Chris, please forward to me a compilation of people's visa information. That was one of the forms that you sent to everybody that I saw earlier this week.
Correct. And I still need some people to fill that out.
So we need that, and I'm told by Tu that she needs to get that into the system on the university campus now.
Okay.
She'll spend a full month getting us permission to be on our campus. Okay?
Okay.
So thank you for that. And Grace, once we have your flight and travel plans, we'll work on your reservations. And if you need to travel to, say, Hue or to Hanoi, I can give you some recommendations. All right? Especially Hanoi. Hanoi, I know like the back of my hand, so I can help you up there. All right, folks. Have a good day. Have a good 2 weeks. You've got a lot to do, but this is a graduate course. So yeah, you got a lot to do. So do
Good.
Chris and Dan. All
Thanks
right.
all.
You bet.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.